I'm Kevin Rooney. Welcome to Goodbye Mr. Chips. Can research tell us how to teach? I'm going to introduce myself a little bit further and the speakers and the plan of action for the next hour and a half. And this particular session is sponsored by Sir William Perkins School, and Chris Muller, who is the head, is going to say a few things at the start. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, we at Sir William Perkins School are particularly pleased and proud to sponsor this debate this morning. Like many institutions in education at the moment, we are very interested in educational research, which we would see as the effort essentially to identify which teaching methods are effective or not as effective. And it's been a continuing conversation within the school for a number of years. So I think what are probably worthwhile just doing is just putting our cards on the table as a school. My staff already conduct action research, and we have a number of pieces of research on the go at the moment, all of which are trying to establish, demonstrate, and dare I even say prove which methods lead to better results and outcomes. We're also a growth mindset school, which is based, as I'm sure most of you know, on the work of Carol Dweck. And what that means is that we don't believe that talent alone creates success, and that individuals their abilities and their growth can be developed through a love of learning, hard work. That is, brains and talent is just a starting point. And in this belief, as I say, we as a staff have been influenced by further educational research of Carol Dweck. We think there's undoubtedly huge gains if it can be shown that by collecting evidence to establish what works best, then we can apply that information to what happens in the classroom. Indeed, as Ben Goldacre said recently, if we can have an evidence-based educational practice, the potential for teachers to become true professionals is already there. It might free them even from government diktat and decree. So that's why we think this debate is so crucial, so important, because underpinning the question of evaluating which teaching methods work is the deeper, more elusive concern of whether research like this is valid and appropriate even in the classroom. Or, quite frankly, to put it more prosaically, as a head, am I wasting my money providing opportunities for the staff to get involved in educational research? So whatever the outcome, we really do need to get this right, and I'm so looking forward to the discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thanks. Give them a round of applause, guys. Thanks very much, Chris. I'm Kevin Rooney. I'm a teacher at a big secondary school out in Hertfordshire, and I'm an occasional writer. I'm a member of the Institute of Ideas Education Forum, and it was my idea, along with Claire Fox, that we have this particular session on the issue of research and education. Let me introduce the speakers. Brilliant panel in the format and the sequence in which they'll speak. First will be Nick Rose on my right here. Nick's a leading practitioner in psychology and research, and he was shortlisted for the TS Teacher Blogger of the Year. And we met in a pub about a year and a half ago at a particular meeting in education in Pimlico, and we put the world to right that night over many, many Guinness. And I realised the people who are into research don't have horns in their head, and he realised the people who are against research generally don't have horns or tails either. So it was a great night. On my left here with a little handsome goatee beard is Jack Marwood, and Jack's a primary school teacher. And he writes, in fact, he runs a fantastic little website called Icing on the Cake. And I came across his blog and Icing on the Cake about a year and a half ago, and asked Jack to come and speak on data and exams last year. And he was absolutely forensic and brilliant. And he was so good that I wanted to get him back. So great to have you as well, Jack. On my extreme right here, metaphorically, literally, whatever way you want to take it, is Munira Mirza. And I'm going to say Munira is a very, very long-time friend, who we hardly ever see. But more importantly, she's the Deputy Mayor of London, and she's got responsibility for culture and education. I remember last year, Munira, I don't know if you remember, we almost had a fight and almost came to blows. We had a big passionate argument at one of the education sessions last year. But what I love about her is you can have a really fierce argument with her, and then afterwards you threw your arms around each other and give each other a big hug. Why she's here on this platform is there was a discussion about a year ago where there was a discussion on research into education, and Munira actually stood up from the floor and made a fantastically eloquent defence of research in education. And I'm going to be honest with you, I haven't heard too many people put up good arguments for the emergence of research in education, and she was the best I ever heard from the floor, so I thought I'd get her on the platform and see what she has to say. And on my left here, my immediate left, is Professor Frank Ferretti, and Frank's got a new book out at the moment, which is on the bookstall in the foyer, which is The Power of Reading from Socrates to Twitter. So you might want to have a look at that. He's written numerous books. I last week reread one of the books he wrote 8 years ago, which is called Wasted: Why Education Isn't Educating. And he wrote it 8 years ago, and I was amazed by how profound a lot of the prophecies and predictions were in that book 8 years down the line. So it was a great book. So that's the, I got one thing mixed up. I apologise. It's not quite the order they're speaking in. Nick will be first, Jack will be second, Frank will be third, and Munira will be last. By all means, please get stuck in. Don't just ask questions, give your view, and we'll have a really good, fraternal, honest, friendly discussion. So I think I'm about finished, and without further ado, I think over to yourself, Nick.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think any debate about research and education needs to start with some very clear things that research can't tell us. One of the things that research can't tell us are our values. There is a difference between is and ought. And whilst educational research may tell us a little bit about how children learn and how we can help them learn, they can't inform us as those wider values. They go beyond scientific questions. Also, in terms of sort of dictating what we do in the classroom, poor old Mr. Chips, it's not educational research that's trying to kind of impose practice on poor old Mr. Chips. I suspect he'd have been sacked long ago, having failed an Ofsted inspection or something. It is there are countless micro decisions that teachers make all the time in the classroom that draw upon, yes, our professional judgment, our intuition, our empathy, and our theory of mind that allow us to basically interact with children and help them learn. However, there are some very important things that I think we can draw from educational research and psychological research that might be applied to the classroom. And I think the first one of these is really developing a sense of professional skepticism, challenging some of the empirical claims that are made about how children learn and how we can make them learn to improve really the sort of pedagogical practices available for teachers to use in the classroom. Back when I was in NQT, I mean sort of many years ago now, I actually got sent on a course to go and study brain gym because my head of department at the time was a big fan and I was intensely sceptical as to whether or not children really did absorb water through the roof of their mouth or through doing kind of weird little cross exercises. They could somehow unite the left and right hemisphere of their brain and learn more effectively. In the same year, I was inspected by an external consultant who was really critical of the fact that I hadn't differentiated for my visual, auditory and kinesthetic learners in my class. Over the years, I've sat through countless insets dominated by claims that have never been adequately tested or have been tested, been found to have been flawed, but teachers don't appear to be aware. The old pyramid of learning suggesting that people only remember 10% of what they read. The idea that there are right-brained and left-brained learners. The idea that children given an internet connection are self-organised learners and don't require any kind of explicit instruction in order to help them learn. So this is something that educational research can challenge. We should challenge the empirical statements made about how children learn and how we can help them learn. And there's a difference between these statements and value statements. Value statements tell us what perhaps we should be doing, our social aspirations, whereas scientific statements can test those empirical claims to weed out those ideas that really don't help. And indeed, I think part of the concerns about research in education is a misunderstanding about science. It's not a set of facts about the world. You could think of it better as a crucible for our ideas. Over time, extended time, it might take 10, 20, even 30 years, the population of ideas that are available to teachers, we hope, will improve as empirical testing creates a kind of a selective environment, weeding out those ideas that repeatedly fail to provide any value for teachers in the classroom, and propagating those ones that might be more useful. And some of the ideas that are more useful may be arising from cognitive psychology. Deans for Impact in the United States have published very recently a very useful, very simple, applicable summary of some of the key psychological findings that might be useful to teachers in the classroom. The idea that prior knowledge is vitally important when learning new things, the idea that memory is a bottleneck to learning, and that recall improves with practice. The idea that beliefs about intelligence can undermine effort, and that we need to be careful how we use praise and rewards. I do understand that there are fears about it, that there are perhaps huge pressures on schools, and as a teacher I've had countless pointless initiatives and practice imposed upon me in my classroom. I think one of the great values of educational research more broadly is that actually it may allow us to have a more intelligent accountability system to operate within as teachers. One example of that is a very famous piece of research that Rob Coe presented at Research Ed a couple of years ago that pointed out the enormous unreliability in assessing teachers' quality through observations. The point that if a lesson was judged outstanding by one observer, the probability a second observer would come to a different judgment was between 50 and 78%. If your lesson was judged inadequate, there was a 90% chance that another observer would come to a different judgment. Education research isn't simply useful to teachers in developing our professional skepticism, in giving us better bets as starting points for when we're planning our teaching and interventions, but also for defending our profession, for developing much more sustainable accountability systems that are fair to the schools and teachers within that system.
I think the thing which I would say with our question, can research tell teachers how to teach? I think the implicit thing in that is that there's a word at the end of that which is probably better. Can research help tell teachers how to teach better? And that seems to be an ongoing theme in education at the moment, as to whether that's possible. Can we get teachers to teach better? Now, for myself, I'm a big fan of research. If by research what we mean is finding things out, finding out more. So I've done lots of research. I write as a teacher, but I've researched phrases like the soft bigotry of low expectations, which is one of those phrases that you hear regularly. Another one is that teachers who aren't very good, bad teachers, will cause children that they teach to learn half as much as a good or an excellent teacher. So again, another one of those things that one hears regularly. I found that neither of those claims particularly stacks up in the research which I've done. And my research has helped me to understand why it might be that those people who make those kinds of claims, why they make those claims, and why it's also both possible to challenge the claims and then to dismiss them. So the bad teacher factoid, which is one of my favourite ones, where you hear this and you see it regularly in research papers to say that a bad teacher causes children to learn a great deal less. It actually came from a paper in 1992 by a man called Eric Hanushek, who's an economist working in the States. And it's questionable on just about every level you can imagine. When you look at the research and what he's, the assumptions that he's made, the assumptions are very, very questionable. And to my mind, it simply isn't true at all. The factoid, you see it all the time. It's used a great deal. It's one of those research claims that has been researched that turns out to actually not to be particularly reliable in any way at all. Most teachers are actually fairly similar in their effectiveness, as far as we can tell from research, and most schools do a fairly good job for the children that they educate, as far as we can tell. In terms of the soft bigotry of low expectations, which you hear all the time, Nick Gibb was saying it the week before last, Michael Gove was a big fan of it, lots of people use that phrase all the time. It's entirely meaningless when you think about it. I'm not quite sure what a soft bigot is as compared to a hard bigot, but it just doesn't mean anything at all. It was written by a speechwriter who worked for George W. Bush, and he wanted to reclaim education as a conservative political gain. And you could look at the educational landscape in Britain and see that education has become something which Conservatives are feeling that they're gaining on in a way that simply wasn't the case when that soundbite was first written. So again, just to bring a bit of research into those things, you can find out a great deal about what people have said and why they might have said those things. The reason why I have time to research those things now, I'm a teacher, teachers are very busy, is that a couple of years ago I began writing about education and looking into what had been said and what is said about teachers at schools and teaching. And I trained as a teacher in 2003, and it turns out, as many other teachers who were trained around about the same time are beginning to find, that a lot of the information which we'd been told, or the ideas which we'd been given, which certainly I'd assumed were fairly well researched, and they turn out not to be particularly well researched and not necessarily to be particularly valid. And a lot of policy initiatives in education, you can say the same kind of thing, they turn out to be wishful thinking or whimsical. And they're based on hopes and aspirations rather than any particular hard evidence. And there are a lot of people like me who are beginning to question things. Nick and I are similar in the same way that we've begun to look at things. And it is very difficult because governments tend to feel that, that surely by now we must know what we should be doing to make sure that everybody is educationally healthy. Surely we must know this. We've been teaching people for a very long time. And recently there was, again, another government report which is funding for disadvantaged pupils, of which we're spending a lot of money at the moment. And I'll read you a section from it which I particularly liked. The Department for Education and the Education Endowment Foundation do not understand enough about the reasons why disadvantaged pupils from some backgrounds do markedly better at school than others. And the assumption there is that we should know that. We should know why that's the case. But we don't quite know why that's the case. We know that is the case, but not quite sure why. And it would appear that government and others seem to think that all we need to do is to find out who are the best teachers, which are the best schools, what's the best structure. And if we could just replicate that, then surely, research should be able to tell us what works and what works best. So in the States, they've set up a what works clearinghouse that's been going for 12, 13 years. In the UK, we have the Education Endowment Foundation, which again, set up to do a similar kind of thing. But all they've really found is the things which don't work, which clearly don't work. Again, as Nick mentioned, things like learning styles and trying to work with children that way, or brain gym, things which simply don't work. And they're quite good at now telling us things that you really shouldn't be doing these things. The Sutton Trust, who are effectively a government organisation, fully funded by the government pretty much, they equally are also, their reports on teaching say, really, we're not quite sure. We know the things which don't work, don't do these things, but we're not sure what is doing. And again, the more I research things, it looks like miracles don't happen. That most teachers do a similar kind of job, and most teaching does a similar kind of job, and it's very difficult to find any examples of things which make dramatically greater gains than what most teachers do most of the time at the moment. So most of my focus as a writer and as a teacher and as a researcher has been just trying to tear down some of the terrible foundations of a lot that is thought about what schools and teachers actually do. Now, some research certainly can help us to focus on teaching. Certainly as a teacher, I regard most of what I do as trying to find out the best way to help the children who I teach, trying to find methods which work, which have some consistent benefit for the children. But for now, I think that, again, the main thing which I would say at the moment is we need to rid the public debate of bad ideas, and my particular thing, bad data. Again, to research something, you really need to be able to measure something. You need to measure it well and accurately. And in education, that's an incredibly difficult task. So we need to rid the public debate of bad ideas before we can even think about building something back up again, so that we can have a clear body of well-researched evidence of what might actually work. So can researchers tell teachers how to teach? Yes, it can certainly help us to understand better ways to teach. Can it make teachers into miracle workers? No, I don't think it can.
It's very interesting because in many ways, although a lot of people claim that this is a novel new debate, this question has been debated in education now for over a century. And literally the same arguments have been had at. And if you look at the first serious attempt to introduce evidence-based education, it was in the United States around just before the First World War, where one of the disciples of Frederick Taylor basically said that we need educational activity that's based on verifiable data, which any technically informed person could appeal to. And it went on to say, until that point, we are practically helpless. We are practically helpless. And I think what he was really expressing was that the teaching profession in America had felt estranged from his own professional authority and was desperately looking for another source of legitimation, which Frederick Taylor and Taylorism and science, they were hoping, could provide. There's a very wonderful book that I urge everybody to read by George Sampson called English for the English in 1921, where he talks about the debate that's breaking out on evidence-based education. It wasn't called that, but it was pretty much the same thing. And he basically makes the point that this is the traditional front bench view. This is what politicians want us to do. And he said, soon we'll go further. Budding psychologists will walk the schools as medical students walk the hospitals. And children will be as useful to the educationist as dogs are to the vivisectionist. They will be inoculated with doses of knowledge and tested for reaction. Their minds will be calibrated periodically with millimetric exactness, and their abilities neatly reduced to succinct tables and beautifully sinuous curves. And he goes on about how there's this kind of powerful pressure already on the educational profession to somehow find a compensating element, to find a substitute for what I would call real teaching. And it seems to me that it's important to realize that this discussion is not about research, because only an idiot would be against educational research, or any research for that matter. The discussion ought to be about whether research can be used to inform what teachers do in terms of everyday practice, whether we can improve teaching in any serious sense through the use of evidence-based research, and indeed, what is evidence in the teaching profession? And I think all those are very kind of significant questions, because very often we confuse data with evidence. They're not the same thing. And the methodologies that are used in pedagogy are extremely naive. I mean, they are in any other discipline, they will be laughed out of court. Never mind the hard science, even the social sciences. So there's a huge problem there. I think the problem that I'm particularly concerned with is not that people are doing research, but it distracts from teachers teaching. I'm maybe in a minority of one, but I don't believe you can teach and research at the same time. It both devalues teaching and it devalues the meaning of research. And if you want to call so-called action research, fine, but you really are talking about a kiddie-land version of research rather than anything that's serious. As far as I understand, whenever I teach, it absorbs 120% of my energies. If I'm going to do a good class, I haven't got the spare capacity that maybe some other people do to do some serious, analysis. That really, it doesn't really kind of work. It also seems to me that what's really at issue here is not the research side, but the attempt to find science and construct science in such a way that it can be drawn upon, it can become the basis for auditing teachers. I mean, that's really what it's all about. It's a way of controlling the teaching profession. And I find it really weird that we have this situation where teachers are creating their funeral, in a sense, if they accept evidence-based education by going along that road. And they're told that this is going to enhance their professional authority. That suddenly, because they put on the white lab coat and do a bit of research, that's going to give them more status. Or actually what it does, it distracts them from what they know best and actually ends up de-skilling them. The whole sort of inadvertent consequence of implementing a strategy based on evidence-based research is to basically estrange teachers from their own professional judgment and get them down on the road where they become essentially technicians, rather than what they ought to be, which are teachers that are using their knowledge base, using their judgment in an effective kind of a way. So it's basically led by a technocratic impulse which leads to the rationalization of learning. And whenever learning becomes rationalized, it does become increasingly emptied of substance. So in those places in the United States where evidence-based education has been introduced, invariably You see a shift towards quantitative from the qualitative. We find assessment procedures increasingly acquiring a Philistine, anti-knowledge-based kind of character. It increasingly enhances education in a quantitative, measurable way. And the worst thing about it is that it encourages education to move towards a direction where what becomes really important is what's measurable. And as you know, many things aren't really measurable. And finally, about values. I don't think that it's possible to separate values from facts in the way that it's been suggested, because our values leads us as to what we valorize. It leads us to indicate, sort of what is really important. Psychological research, for all its beauty, is actually based in education on the value of motivation. I mean, almost everything that psychologists do in education is about how you motivate young people. And by enhancing motivation and making that the principal objective of education, you do pay a very high price. Because what you do is you kind of minimize the importance of other aspects of learning. If it's motivation is everything, then you reorganize your teaching method in such a way that the communication of knowledge, the kind of the love of knowledge in particular, becomes sort of pretty much sidelined. It leads to an emphasis on what works. And what works is a very strange idea. I'm not really sure what actually means. And it overlooks the fact that at the end of the day, the one thing we learned after 200 years of pedagogic development is that there is more than one way of skinning a cat. And that actually what works for you might not work for me. And the way that we teach does depend very much upon context. And if we ignore that, then what we end up doing is reframing the prejudices you were talking about self-bigotry. But basically what we do is we reframe prejudice in a scientific language. So what we end up is what we have at the moment, where basically we have prejudice masquerading as research, which seems to be the outward development, which is why I can predict with utmost certainty that everything you learn, everything will come out of evidence-based education this year will be disproved the year after. And the old cycle that's been going on for 100 years will continue, where today's flavor of the month will be made fun of in a very short kind of period of time. And it seems to me that if we want to get real, if we want to get really serious, we should be thinking about how we enhance the professional authority of teachers through the role that they play as providers of knowledge, instead of trying to turn them into something they're not particularly good at, which is research and technicians. And I do think that we do need a reality check here, rather than repeating again the cycle that's been going on for over 100 years and not learning from that. Those people who are interested in research should look at the evidence of history, which is, to me, much more compelling than action research.
So I think all of us share a healthy skepticism about what's defined or what's called research in education today. And the previous speakers have talked about the tendency of governments and politicians and teachers themselves trying to reach for evidence in the way that overweight people reach for diets. They go for fads, they look for the silver bullet. This week it's brain gym, next week it's multiple intelligences. There are all sorts of very appealing pills in the education market peddled by consultants who can promise you that if you teach in this particular way, you will pass your Ofsted and you will be judged outstanding. So I think all of us, from what everyone said, can dismiss that kind of very simplistic and unsophisticated approach to research and evidence making, which is very often politically motivated, but it's also driven by, as Frank said, to some extent, a degree of desperation from schools and teachers who are looking for a way to try and improve in what is a very pressurized environment in teaching today. But at the same time, I don't think any of us can say that the whole process of teaching and how people, in particular how children learn, is merely something that's left to gut instinct, or that teachers with subject knowledge and subject expertise find their own way and never share that or never discuss or reflect on that in any more transferable way than just talking occasionally to other teachers in the staff room. If we did think that, then there would be really no reason to have teacher training or education departments in universities. And in fact, we would just accept that teachers would come out of university with a degree and we would send them straight into schools and to be apprenticed in a school environment, which is starting to happen increasingly. But I personally feel that there is a role for universities and for education in its broader sense in the world of teacher training. I don't think it's something that you rely on with gut instinct, or if there is gut instinct, I think that you can analyse that and try to understand why certain things work or not. The issue of research, if you take it away from the current political environment, in that if you try and remove the current political motivations behind research and just look at it in its own terms, I think there is educational research that is actually quite valuable to teachers. There are aspects of cognitive science, cognitive psychology, which are interesting and maybe useful. Things about memory recall and how children absorb knowledge and facts, how motivation and behaviour and context affects the way that children learn, the way that teachers teach. That's not to say that research or science is a silver bullet or it tells teachers how to teach, but that it can give us a greater understanding of how human beings learn and how they interact with each other. And it may be difficult for people to call that a science, but I would say that most of social science is very difficult for people to call a science. The whole of social science is riven with difficult questions about how you assess impact of people's behaviour, how you analyse their attitudes, how you analyse social factors. It's not like the natural sciences. It's not something that you can measure only in quantitative ways. There is a huge qualitative dimension to that kind of research. But it doesn't mean that it lacks value or that teachers shouldn't be aware of it. And as Jack and Nick have suggested, educating teachers about research helps make them better skeptics about what goes for research these days. And some of the most interesting stuff that I've read and some of the most interesting teachers I've spoken to are those who have gone away and educated themselves about things like brain gym and so-called evidence-based policy, and have come away realising that there are limits to what any piece of research can tell you. You can't come away with a kind of clear blueprint for the perfect lesson or how you run a school. And I think that those are teachers who in some ways feel more empowered and more autonomous than teachers who are told by their head or by the EEF or anyone else what works and what doesn't work. I think those are teachers who have decided to take their own profession and their own practice into their own hands and reflecting on it. And different research methods can have different effects as well. So there are some attempts to try and bring in more medical type evaluation like randomized control testing, which is at one end of what you'd call educational research. So testing whole schools or whole classes against each other using different methods, which is in many ways a very blunt way of trying to evaluate the impact of any kind of teaching, and it misses the complexity of many, many different variables. But then there are other types of research in practice which I think are interesting, like the engagement in lesson study and teachers observing each other and then reflecting on what happened in a lesson and why something may have worked or not, which is much more ground level, I suppose what you'd call action research. I haven't really seen teachers complaining that their research distracts them from their ability to teach well. I think often the opposite. I've seen lots of teachers say their willingness and their ability to engage with other teachers in their school or further afield has helped them to reflect better on why they do what they do and why it works and whether it could work in a different context. And I think it makes them much more conscious of the way that they do things, which I think can only be a healthy thing. From my perspective, I work in a regional government, so we funded a large project called the London Schools Excellence Fund, which is £24 million, to invest in teacher training and support for teachers, often focusing on subject-specific teaching and subject-specific teacher training. And we asked all the people who we'd funded to evaluate the impact of their projects but recognising that evaluation is a very difficult thing to do, and really just to be able to say whether the methods that they had employed had made any difference in their mind about how they had taught and whether they'd had a better effect on the students. And we've had some of the early evaluations in, which are very positive. They're not all the same method of research. They've all done something which they feel is appropriate to the way that they've carried out their projects. But if we didn't see any of that evaluation, we wouldn't know if any of the methods that they had used had actually made a difference, and they themselves wouldn't know. So I'm not quite sure how you square the circle, how you ask teachers to reflect on their practice and to think about how they can do things better, which is something clearly they want to do as a profession, and yet at the same time not try and measure that impact in any way. And if there is a better way of doing it, I'd like to know, but I think at the end of the day it does come down to asking people, did it work or not in this context? Not to say it works in every context in other ways, but whether there is any value to it. And to my mind, research has to be qualified. It has to be, we have to recognise its value, but also its limitations.
Thank you, Mia. Give them all a round of applause, my guys. Guys, I think that I have a difficulty right now because I'm trying to find a way to drill down to find out the extent to which there's real disagreement. So if I take 3 of the speakers on the panel, would I be right in saying that the 3 except Frank, that, well, some research can be a bit dodgy, a bit of it's politicized, but of course there's really good research, which we should take. Whereas Frank, you said at one point, well, research is good, there's nothing wrong with it, but we're not really talking about research. So really my question, if anybody wants to pick it up, is what do we think the nub of the problem is here? Bearing in mind, when I speak to teachers, some teachers do feel empowered and reprofessionalised by the use of EB, evidence-based education and research, whereas others consider it an absolute attack on their autonomy and professional judgment. So help me out, guys. Where's the real nub of the issue here? Anybody want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pitch in on that. I think one of the things that's happened over my career as a teacher is really a deprofessionalising influence on kind of sort of teachers as practitioners and as professionals. I mean, when I started, all the kind of national strategy policies all arrived in great big folders. We chose questioning because it was the thinnest one to start with. Things like 3-part lessons and all these kind of very restrictive practices on the way that you should do things. And of course, VAK featured very prominently in this. And I've spent my entire time, I've got an unusual background. Before I became a teacher, I was a parapsychologist. And I honestly thought I'd left all the problems of dodgy methodology and strange theory behind me. In some ways, I think education was worse because a lot of teachers didn't even question, didn't even challenge, didn't feel empowered to ask impertinent questions. And a great deal of it is arguments from received wisdom and from authority figures telling individuals, what you should be doing from moment to moment in your classroom. So I see a reflection upon what the evidence base tells us, being an evidence-informed practitioner, as a way of really defending my practice. If you want to impose something on the way I teach, you'd better make sure it works better than what I'm doing.
Frank.
Yeah, but that's an argument I agree with, which is basically that we're very, very good at proving what doesn't work. And that seems to be a problem that teachers have confronted for a very long time. I remember being in The Hague and debating 3 of the foremost proponents of multiple intelligence and different learning styles. And they were bringing out the data and the information that this is absolutely conclusively proves how these things are. And it really was just, as far as I could tell, just a bunch of charlatans, sort of driven by their own particular prejudice. They really meant it well, but it was completely transparently of very little value. And it seems to me the nub of the debate here is asking the question, what works, right? Because that assumes that within the school, within the educational kind of context, there is some way that can almost, through a particular kind of practice, can almost immediately or over a period of time, measurably sort of do something and gain certain effective outcomes that have been missing beforehand. And for 150 years, this notion that there is something like this that could be discovered through psychological theory has been driving hundreds of people, to write all kinds of theses. And it's been a very elusive quest for the very simple reason that that simply doesn't exist. If I was a headmaster in London and I was obsessed with the question of what works, I would say, well, what works is bring into my school 100 Eritrean refugees, 100 Polish kids, from working class backgrounds, and the same teachers in that school will get much better results, from those kids of comparable social standing than the English ones. And it's not, the same teacher doing the same thing, because the really important things that count are the fact that those kids are Polish or Eritrean and a certain kind of background, different kind of, sort of cultural regime and everything else. And that's the way it is. And therefore, as teachers, what we do as individuals is do the best possible job by learning from our experience. I think the only point I really agree with strongly is Munira's point about teachers talking to each other and watching each other and reflecting on that, because I think teachers need to be very conscious. But that's not research. That's common sense. I mean, we do that all the time. And that with the metaphor of science is stretching the point a little bit. So I do think we have to understand that the what works question, by definition, breeds its own values, which invariably go down in the wrong direction.
Munira.
I mean, the problem is that teachers haven't been able to come together and reflect on their teaching. There hasn't been a space for that in schools in Britain for a long time, and it's starting to happen now. And I would say there are two different forces. There is the kind of the more institutional, maybe government-led desire for evidence and what works. But there is also, to a large extent, a grassroots reaction from the teaching profession, which you see from bloggers like Jack and Nick, from conferences like Research Ed, from networks that are starting to develop, where teachers are coming together on their own and reflecting on the way that they do things and what evidence and research is out there. I think there's a difference between science and scientism, and this idea that you can use existing research to tell you what to do. Tom Bennett has a very good phrase, which is saying what worked is not the same as saying what works. So reflecting on why something happened the way that it did, reflecting on all the various variables and the context and comparing different situations, that has value. It can encourage teachers to reflect and ask questions. And it's that level of research and inquiry that I think is important. And it would be a mistake to dismiss all teachers who are using the word research as being scientists or trying to be more scientific in a kind of crude way. I don't think that that's fair or reasonable. It's a bit like dismissing the whole of the science of nutrition on the basis that some people get drawn to fad diets, or dismissing medicine on the basis that some people then start approving of homeopathy. There is junk science out there and there's junk research, but it doesn't mean that the field of science in this area is irrelevant. Completely. I think it's just it does need to be more sophisticated than a lot of people recognise.
Very interesting, very, very interesting. But let me just push you on that, because I really don't know here where we're going. So teachers coming together and talking, and you talked about reflecting, and you talked about research ed and grassroots. That's dead on. And some staff rooms, teachers actually talk and share, give each other tips and so on and so forth. So really, is that what you're talking about here? Or are we talking about something much more fundamentally different? So, for example, in my school, you have to demonstrate via your performance management targets your embrace of action research, right? And so it's Carol Dweck, usually, that you have to, your 3 targets, blah, blah, blah. So what I'm really trying to get at from you is, my instinct, I could be wrong, is this, even though people talk about Nick and research ed, that's absolutely driven from the top, and it's an absolute quest that is being imposed by head teachers and from government and so on and so forth to try to get those teachers to get the best results. Now, am I wrong just in my impression of that? Do you see this as different and really just encouraging people to be a bit more reflective and talk about what works? I'm really keen to just try and clarify, because my instinct is there's a lot more going on with this embrace of what people talk about, research and education, action research, evidence-based education.
By the way, I don't think it's bad that governments try and get teachers to teach better. I mean, the way that they do it may be deeply flawed, but I don't think it's a bad instinct that...
What about if I'm
politically
teaching
wanted.
well and I don't want to do the performance management?
Well,
and
you know,
I'm
then
saying
there's-
you shouldn't
yeah, and-
impose that on me?
No, I completely understand, and that's a question for a head teacher, how they run the school. I happen to think that somebody who's being forced to participate in research or in programs that they don't want to be involved in is completely pointless. You know, you're not going to get anything worthwhile out of them. But I do think that the stuff that's happening amongst teachers themselves, the communities and the networks that are emerging from in a grassroots way, and through the internet, which has been a very empowering force, is a positive thing. It's a different kind of research, and it's using different kinds of... it's got slightly different motivations. But I don't think it lacks value.
Again, I think that it's also very interesting. And again, the idea that we're trying to get teachers to teach better. The thing with that is that implies that teachers are teaching badly, or some teachers are teaching badly now. Now, there may be incompetent teachers, and that, you know, there certainly are people who are clearly incompetent in any profession, and you'd be surprised if there weren't any incompetent teachers. But the idea that there's some teachers are teaching badly and that we need to get people to teach better, again, the evidence which we have suggests that isn't the case. You know, most schools are doing a pretty good job. Most children are achieving the things which they're expected to achieve. So I think, again, this narrative of the idea that we're trying to get things, we're trying to find ways to help people to teach better is a curious one, because, again, it just puts all the pressure onto schools and teachers, when that pressure, as Frank says, may be because of issues and factors outside of the school's control. You know, it makes a vast difference if you're teaching children whose parents have moved from one country to yours compared to parents who have not been able to move even from their locality. So it does make a huge difference. Again, context matters a great deal. But this narrative of trying to get teachers to teach better, it's an easy sell. Let's just blame the teachers for
I don't think
issues.
it's about blaming teachers at all.
But
there are some areas where you could argue that in the teaching of reading, how you teach children to become literate. I mean, it's extremely fraught politically. There's a debate about phonics and whether it's the right method, or, you know, whether it's been proven. You know, I don't think that it's irrelevant for teachers to reflect on methods of teaching in that area. And we funded quite a few programs that have claimed to teach reading in a more effective and more efficient way. Efficiency is an issue as well. Some teachers that we've spoken to said, you know, we trialled this particular approach to teaching a module, and we found actually over time it helped to compress a certain amount of teaching in a short space of time. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why that might happen, but, you know, they've reflected on why that might be the case. I think that has value.
But different teachers would teach reading according to different strategies,
yeah,
and get equally good results. And it seems to me that,
well,
if you look at the debate on reading, it is one of the most politicized, moralistic debates that exists. And there, the research, I think, is highly dubious, precisely because the underpinnings of it, on both sides, is kind of what in otherwise called advocacy research, where people already know what it is. If you're into phonics, then you demonstrate conclusively that without phonics the world will die. If you're into sort of a whole language or any of these other things, that's the only way you can teach kids. But the reality is that in the real world, in the classroom, I can teach sort of according to a certain way that's different than yours.
But how did you know? How does a teacher know? Because actually a teacher is trained. We do accept that teachers have to be trained in order to go and start teaching children how to read. So they don't just come out of university, or they don't even come out of school and just say, right, I'm now going to go and teach them. Yeah. You do start by setting certain assumptions. So they're not coming to this tabula rasa.
No, they got pedagogic training.
So what is pedagogic training if it's not based on some assumption or knowledge or some?
Of course, yeah. I mean, I studied again. You need to have research, but that's different than evidence-based research, and it's different when you have research that's oriented towards proving a certain strategy as being more effective than the other. And I think that the minute you go down that road, you can predict with utmost certainty what the results will be. So your evaluations in London, I'm not surprised that you're getting the evaluations that are by and large positive. I mean, what else do you expect to get? And it seems to me that the very idea of evaluation almost invariably invites more evaluation, and you end up in a kind of situation where subjectivity becomes increasingly the dominant influence on that.
Nick, go on.
Kevin, going back to your original question, I don't think your problem is research. I think your problem is the way that accountability is set up currently within schools. And I think that where you're having practices imposed on you, you're not certain about whether it's genuinely helping you improve your teaching. I think those are genuine questions that need answering. One of the big problems is that teachers and schools are under a kind of a microscope at the moment, under a huge amount of pressure, and leap for whatever gold, silver bullet or panacea happens to be operated to them, that offered them that day. Classic example actually is the growth mindset school. Actually, if you look at the research by people like David Yeager, you discover actually that the successful interventions here are very subtle nudges, perhaps trying to overcome stereotype threat or to encourage individuals to believe that they can apply more effort and see some gains from it. The education system is in a situation where, yes, they are going to be sort of looking for magic beans and homeopathy, in order to try and solve their problems. But there's only one way, really, out of this. Frank is right about one thing. I mean, this has been going around a long time. Over 100 years ago, William James talking about psychology for teachers, and we're still kind of saying the same things today. Why hasn't education moved on as other professions have? And I think it's genuinely because we're not really accumulating those better bets in terms of what might help children learn and how children learn. Psychology's moved on enormously from that Pavlov bit that you talked about. I mean, we've got sort of some pretty good, solid theories on working memory and cognitive load that can be applicable. Now, do they just give you instant solutions that are going to solve all your problems? No, it requires a mature profession looking at these things with a degree of skepticism, questioning authority, and really trying to see whether or not in your classroom, in your context, it's having the impact that you intended it to have.
Frank, what a reasonable guy. Part of research ed, he talked about brain gym, multiple intelligences, all that nonsense disproved by the science. Would you take issue with the way that Nick's approaching it? Do you think that's fair enough, or do you think there's still a wee bit of a problem?
I'm open to the ideas that he's putting forward. I'm also open to the idea of all the networks that have been set up that Munir mentioned. I think it's great when teachers get together and discuss and kind of struggle with the problems they face. But you ask the question why education hasn't moved on. I don't think education will ever move on, for the very simple reason that that you're loading onto education problems that it cannot really solve, and therefore I'd far rather that we cracked one problem that we can crack, which is to take teachers' professional authority a little bit more seriously, to value what teachers do in a way that we're not doing at the moment by ensuring that they are really seen as kind of authoritative voice of their subjects. And I think if you do that, then you have a more positive educational system. And every country I've been to where I've seen good schools, whether it's in Finland or in Sweden or East Europe, the schools that really work are ones where the teachers are, they are serious people. And they kind of seen as being serious people. They're respected. And there's a reason for that. And until we crack that problem, we are going to have these same debates all the time.
About to go out, but I'm down to ask one final question. I hope you know who Research Ed, if you're new to this debate, Research Ed's a group of teachers came together who believe in the value of research. I want to ask a quick question about Research Ed. It seems to me that you're on solid ground, all the teachers who believe in research, when you're trying to disprove what are bad practices, like multiple intelligence, brain gym, etc. But when Research Ed have started to move in the direction I think you're moving in, which is where you're trying to find out what works, is that not where the problem comes? Because it comes back to Frank's point about there's many ways to skin a cat.
Research Ed is a grassroots movement. I no more represent Research Ed than anybody else in this room. I mean, it's teachers and researchers meeting together to talk and hammer out these questions. Are there better bets than brain gym, multiple intelligence? Yes, there are. Okay, there are better starting points that if you're thinking about how am I going to help my kids get through this terminal assessment in 2 years' time, this is a really hard idea, riddled with misconceptions. How can I teach this in a way that might help them really understand it, really know it? There are better bets that we are starting to accumulate. And that's how science really works. It's not an semblance of what works. It is a selective pressure on the ideas, the empirical claims being made about how children learn and how we can help them learn. But this gets lost. This nuance gets lost. Even something like feedback, which is at the top of the EEF toolkit list. A third of the studies in that meta-analysis actually found that feedback had a negative influence on student outcomes. How you implement things in your classroom is going to be very sensitive to context, and I agree with Frank there. And if there's a role for teachers as researchers, in a very loose, wide sense, actually looking at what you're putting into your classroom, and is it actually having the effect that you set out to try and have? Perhaps using your peers to help you reflect on your practice. Well, my particular interest is trying to develop formative tools that teachers can use to try and get a little bit more than just reflection on its own when making these judgments. Is this actually helping this kid move forward in terms of their learning?
Brilliant, guys, that's good. We've got a whole half hour. We'll take about 3 or 4 questions at a time, or points. We'll come back, we'll go back, and we'll let the discussion rip.
Okay, I'm Karen Goldberg, and I run the Autism Centre for Education and Research at University of Birmingham. And I'm with Frank, really, on this, and I want to just use a few examples from autism research to illustrate what I think the key issues are here. I'm for research, I'm an educational researcher, but I came into research from a background in teaching. And one of the issues that's really struck me about the research that's happening in the world of autism is it's very much focused on interventions, set models that are then being researched as to whether they're effective or not. A few years ago, I worked with a group of colleagues to undertake an international literature review on the research. And the conclusions that came from that literature review, and we started off with over 400 papers in the field. There were 2 issues that really emerged from that. The first issue was there is no conclusive evidence that any one intervention works better than any other intervention. Absolutely not. And we're not the only people that have drawn that conclusion. Many people have. The second issue that emerged very clearly from that research was that what's happening, what are people looking at when they're conducting intervention research? They're looking at things that you can measure. So 90% of research in the autism field is looking at applied behaviour analysis, because you can look at the behaviours of children and whether they're learning, for example, to respond to prompts. There's a number of different examples of what they're looking at. There's 2 key problems related to that for me. One of the issues is that what's measurable isn't necessarily what's meaningful for a child with autism in their education. The second point that's now being discussed very widely in the field of autism research is that much of the research that is happening outside of the classroom, and it's happening in laboratory settings or clinical settings. It's not easy to translate or move that research into the classroom environment. But to me, that misses the point, because I think there is a crucial issue here, and that is that when you're looking at evidence-based practice, and I want to come back to that point first, is Frank makes the distinction between good research and the evidence-based practice movement. And I think the problem with the evidence-based practice movement is exactly that you think that you can find an answer of what works, and you have to argue that if A happens, then B will happen. And we know in the field of autism that although there's a lot of evidence that visual strategies work, for example, they will work in different ways for different children. And different contexts matters. But I think it is very problematic because it's becoming so authoritarian. In the US, if you're not using an evidence-based practice as a teacher, you can be taken to court for it. So I think what we really need to be doing is to look at how researchers can conduct more meaningful research that can have a meaning for practitioners in the classroom. But the assumptions need to be that research, knowledge that arises out of research, and knowledge and experience that arises from the teaching professions are 2 different kinds of knowledge and research, but they have to be equally valued.
I'm very sympathetic to what's been said about research in social sciences. So I was quite interested. I've heard John Hattie's name being mentioned quite often recently, and a lot of teachers are being encouraged to have a look at John Hattie's work, where he seems to, I don't know very much about it, but he seems to have done what the lady just before me talked about, looking at a lot of the research that results and tried to sort of average it out or to see rank the effect, the value, and I'd be quite curious to know what the panel think about John Hattie's research. I'm a little bit concerned, I think, in the way that the lady is, that amongst there, or the way that Nick's been talking, amongst there are some people who have been using, for example, feedback in certain ways, and that's worked. Others for whom it hasn't worked, and all of it seems to have sort of been sort of mishmashed together, and I'm not sure how useful it can really be.
Yeah, my question for the panel, what is your model of educational success? Because in my experience on the receiving end of sort of government initiatives like that, it seems to be that they're trying to create students who are great at memorizing details in a textbook. Is that all research should aim for?
I just looked at 300 proposals for undergraduate research, and every single one of them was about what works in the classroom. And that struck me not something positive, but something quite desperate. And listening to you talk, I think what you're forgetting is that you're doing something else that's not, what you could loosely call research. But philosophy for kids is very popular in schools. And I think what you're describing, the best things you're doing, is philosophy. It's the beginning of philosophy. All the reflection, the criticism of research projects, it's the beginning of philosophy. And, you know, and this is Ruth Sigmund's here, and did a very good philosophy of education journal on current fads and fashions in education, where people just thought about them and critiqued them. But you do have a real problem if you keep emphasising evidence-based research, because the critique of learning styles, you go to Coffield in 2004, showed to be invalid, unreliable, and cognitively confused, and they've gone on from strength to strength. Right? And every time you get a negative critique, nothing happens. And really good positive research, Aaron Mrotzka's research on what works in American universities, what works, why they're not learning to think critically, they say they're not reading enough and they're not writing enough. Right? And teachers can find that out without doing any empirical research. Right? That's the real issue. If you think it's a matter of empirical research, there's not very much that's good, and when it is good, it gets ignored. Because you've got to win the arguments with teachers, and that's what you're doing. And the best positive thing of this groundswell is that you're beginning to do philosophy. Right? So I'd make a plea for philosophy for teachers.
Let me get the panel to just pick up what they want from those points, and then we'll go back. Go on, Nick.
Yeah, well, just to pick up on the philosophy, I'm a big fan of philosophy of science, particularly sort of the idea that we can try and falsify some of the sort of the claims that rocket around in education. And I think there's two ways you can tell that you're a social scientist or a teacher who's interested in research. One is that you're going to argue about the validity of the things that are being measured, whether that's in Hattie's meta-analysis or in autism research. And the second thing that will probably typify you as a teacher who's interested in the research surrounding education is that honest expression of uncertainty when you're asked about what works in the classroom.
Jack.
The question about John Hattie. John Hattie has been a big name for the last 6-7 years in education, and certainly in the schools which I've worked in, we've heard a great deal about him, and I've certainly read lots of his work. As a broad number of issues to consider with John Hattie. Firstly, he uses effect sizes, which is a very contested area. So basically you say, I test the children before I do something, and then I do something and I get another number at the end and look at the two numbers. I'm a statistician by training, and numbers don't work like that. You can't just say, I tested this and I got this. They could be from the same distribution, and he never takes that into account, as do lots of people who don't work with effect sizes. So there are issues there. Having said that, he's done a huge project looking into what people have said about education, and his basic conclusion is that everything works. Which is the message which I would say most teachers do a fairly good job. He says that some things don't work, so having a uniform policy doesn't make a particular difference. But he identifies some things that do work, because basically teachers do a fairly good job. As long as you think it's going to work, it's probably going to work for the children you're working with. There are a number of other things with John Hattie. He's quite strong on belief. You have to believe things, which again, from somebody with a scientific background, always strikes me as being slightly worrying, because he just thinks that you need to believe that you're having an effect for that to happen. But basically, he's been quite influential. He's just brought a lot onto it just moved things forward, made people think about what they're doing a lot more. But again, it's well worth being very sceptical about what he says.
Frank?
Yeah, I'm actually involved in a research project for Leverhulme on reading and on the reading wars, which I'm particularly interested in. And when I began the research, I have to admit it, I wasn't neutral because I'm a big fan of phonics teaching. So I thought, that my research, will enhance that, and I'm still a big fan. But what really disturbed me in the research debate was that both sides of the argument were using research to prove what is in fact a value point. And they both have very clear sets of values, but rather than being upfront and honest about it, they were using research. And I looked at California, which is very interesting, because in California, you literally have families where children who are maybe 6 years older than their brothers would have been told, and their parents, that we can conclusively demonstrate that the research base for phonics is absolutely robust and it will improve. And then, after it's been implemented, nothing much changed. The same problem was occurring, nothing really very much changed. So they then bring in whole language. And again, it's almost like the word was changed, but the paragraphs were the same. We now conclusively prove that whole language teaching has been scientifically validated and everything else. And this has gone on now in 6 cycles. And in every case, what I find very disturbing, that's what my new book is about, is rather than engaging with the educational problem of how you teach kids how to read, and deal with what is the key problem in reading, which is the love of language, getting kids to read between lines, getting meaning from the experience, the scientific sort of arguments, so-called, have distracted people, and people become fanatical, zealous, sort of, to the point at which they don't talk to each other. They actually swear at each other and denounce. One side calls the other one subversive, and the other one calls the other side right-wing neoliberal. And that's really what comes out of the situation, because what we're talking about here is in fact a kind of a very dangerous process that misses the obvious, which has been there for 150 years. It's been staring us in the eye, and I don't know why we keep on ignoring it.
A couple of the questioners from the floor talked about how they were sceptical about research and the way in which research is used and the way in which it's influencing practitioners and being almost quite authoritarian, and then referred to good research that proves the opposite. Or, inevitably what we end up doing, I mean, even Frank does this to some extent. He talks about, from my experience, having gone around all these countries, I have seen that in the best countries, the teachers are the most valued and they have authority. There are assertions, we're making truth claims all the time about education, but they're not always valid judgments, but they are based on what we observe and what we think is a link between effect and consequence, or cause and consequence. And I think that it is a bigger issue in the social sciences, which the social sciences are not fantastic at being translated to practice. They have to be mediated, and practitioners reading research is not in itself a bad thing. Practitioners reading research in the hope that it will tell them what to do and give them a clear answer is a mistake, and I do recognise that has happened. I think it's appalling, the idea that in America you could be prosecuted for not being an evidence-based teacher. There should always be space for teachers to ignore this and to say that they don't want to participate. If they choose to read research or different methodologies and make judgments and use their own autonomy to decide which one they choose, and I think that's fine.
When you came back on Frank there, you said, well, Frank, even you are into research. And then you start to talk about, teachers who listen to each other and pick things up and learn from each other. What I'm wanting to throw out to you is, of course you'd want to do that in the school. In the staff room you want to go when a young teacher wants to observe an older teacher and pick up tricks of the trade and little things that you can use. Of course that's a given. But are we not talking about something fundamentally different here?
No, I don't mean tips. I don't mean the sort of the way of disseminating knowledge through the staff room, which is older teachers giving their wisdom and experience. I do think research is more than just giving helpful tips to junior teachers or even your peers. As an analogy, take another area of policy making, which is the area of regeneration, economic regeneration. There isn't a silver bullet to how you regenerate cities, but there is huge amounts of research on cities that have regenerated. Now, you could say to city policymakers, just do your own thing, go with your instinct, go with your gut, do what you think will work in your context. Or you could encourage them to actually read what's happened in hundreds of cities around the world and look at the analysis of what's happened and draw some conclusions. Now, you may not have a silver bullet that you can apply to your city, but you can reflect on certain trends and results and consequences.
But you used the word earlier on, transferable.
But it's not always transferable,
Yeah.
but there are aspects of it which you can see may be relevant in your situation.
In urban planning, but are you saying that there are transferable, sort of knowledges or practices that you can just, sort of take from one context to the other and will have the same kind of effect or roughly the same?
No, what I'm saying is that the whole area of social science is riddled with these complications and the difficulty of being able to say this is immediately transferable from one case to another. And if you are critical of it in the world of educational research, actually you have to be critical of it in many, many other areas. And yet we do find that as practitioners that it is useful to understand what's happened in other areas.
Heaps of people trying to get in.
Just a question, just to turn around the discussion a little bit, which has been a lot of discussion about research. But you can't have research within education without a theory of education. So I think one of the interesting things and the positive things about the moment, there is a bit of a groundswell in the sense that teachers are struggling to articulate a professional voice. And one of the things that educationists can positively contribute to that process is to try and deepen the discussion of education. So looking to the future and being positive, I just wonder if the panel could suggest some good educational theory that they've read recently that might help us to deepen that discussion.
Thanks.
Frank, I'm going to volunteer to help you with your research on literacy in relation to reading. I've dipped into your book and I'm fascinated. Now, I'd just like to address the man on your left who says that all teaching is absolutely lovely. Honestly, it's not. I helped to run a literacy strategy, by the way, and we recently found that over 70% of 12-year-olds in surrounding secondary schools had reading ages below that of 10-year-olds, okay? A number of them were struggling with three-letter words. Now, taught by a method that we have found by some pretty basic sort of research, really basic stuff, to work, we found we could teach them pretty quickly and get some pretty strong results. And we've been applying that into primary schools recently. Now, I'm also aware that some of the research methodology that's used is phony. Simple statistics get over sort of worked on, probably to conform to the prejudices of the people who govern the strategy, in the universities, the researchers in universities. And if you keep your research methodology absolutely simple, you just look at the basic results, you can make your comparisons, you can draw your conclusions, and you can see the varying conditions that might have affected what happened. And that's how research should be done, in my view.
Thank you. Toby, help me out, because I can't really see the hands at the front. Okay, on you go. Yeah.
Okay, can I first of all put my question, which I'd like everyone on the panel to ask, because everybody always talks about, oh yes, values are very important, and Nick Gibbs said that recently at the Research Ed. What I'd like to just know is what values are important for you, if you could all say that, and I think that's very important and very germane, because the values that I think are important in education, particularly, Frank, you were talking about it being 100 years old. Well, I've just been reading about the discussions that were had in Parliament at the beginning of the 20th century, when they were talking about creating a British education system that wanted to be systematic, like the Germans and the Americans and the French, but also, peculiar to Britain, they wanted it to be liberal and autonomous. They wanted the education system to inculcate those values. And I think today's discussion on evidence-based education represents a real retraction, a real abdication of a commitment to those values in its search for certainty. It's like a child trying to look at how a butterfly works and takes it apart, and you end up with nothing. And the best thing that teachers can do to do that, as an English teacher, the thing that's helped me most in teaching 16-year-olds how to read and improve their work has not been anything empirical. It's been Kant and Ernest Cassirer and trying to relate that to my practice.
I've been a primary school teacher, this is my 14th year, but I also volunteer in the NHS. And what strikes me is a difference between how the NHS staff at the hospital that I volunteer at talk about research and who does the research and what it looks like in education. There aren't nurses sitting around thinking that they are also going to reform how we treat sick babies, for example. That's a different person who does that. And I think that Nick and Monero, when you talk about research, I think you mean something different to Frank. And sometimes you were talking about things that you call research, but that aren't really related to research. Like, we all know multiple intelligences, but like the national strategies and those things that put extreme pressures on teachers, they don't derive their power because people call them valuable because of research. They derive their power because governments put them in and because head teachers allow that pressure to go down to teachers. That's not research, I don't think, that's doing that in classrooms, forcing people to teach 3-part lessons or et cetera, et cetera. So one of the other question that I had then was that I think out there are a lot of things which maybe aren't research, because in the NHS, research is where we say, actually, it's not smells that cause flu, it's a germ, and we will use nasal sprays and free injections. We'll use nasal sprays to stop these germs making people sick. That's research. And in education, I find now out there are lots of things which don't call themselves research, like books written by, say, the charter schools in the States, Teach Like a Champion. That isn't calling itself research, yet books like that, blogs that people write, they are having lots of followers and people thinking, actually, this theory makes better sense to me, regardless of whether it's been tried with 20,000 children or not. It works better.
My question is similar to Toby's. I think if we give up on the idea of evidence-based research, then I think we really need to defend university departments and pedagogy a bit more. So, for example, if you favour subject knowledge, what's better for an English teacher? Why should they not just go and do a PhD in English? Why should they study in an education department? And what kind of ideal proposal would Dennis be looking for from his undergraduates? What would that look like? So I think we need more of a defence of pedagogy.
Research, as I see it, is a set of tools. It's just one approach out of many to help us find out how to do education and teach our children more effectively. If we don't use research, what's the alternative? Imagine if the world from now on didn't have research. Would we be in a better or a worse position? So that would be my reflection.
At the moment, I think if education is about the becoming rather than the doing, becoming the student that gets 9 A's, whatever, etc., then of course there is room for research, because all you do is kick out the teacher that got 6 D's. You know, it's like straightforward, I think, like that. Perhaps I'm missing the point, but if education is about the doing rather than becoming, which it should be, then obviously these things can't be measured, but at the moment it's skewed towards an area where it is about becoming, and that's why there is a place for research.
As a student, I genuinely just think that research is atrocious, it's useless, it's never worked for me. No one I've ever talked to, teachers can either teach or they can't teach. And the ones that try and do these things, they're just bad. You have to go away, you go to the library, you do it yourself. And if you're good enough, you're smart enough, you're driven enough, you succeed. And the teachers that are genuinely good, in my opinion, especially, are the ones who can either just teach or they're passionate. They know their subject, they care about their subject, and they teach it in a good way.
We talked about whatever works here. Just maybe final comments to address that. So are we talking about what helps them, as Nick said, pass their final assessment? If it's about passing exams, what works is teaching to the test and doing their coursework for them. What is it exactly that we're talking about here? What do we value in education?
I don't know whether people know about the difference between negative and positive. First of all, theology, politics, and then we can start talking about ethics, which is, I think, what's coming up now. Negative theology is the idea that we know what God is not, and there's a whole lot of theology around this, but we don't know what God is. Negative politics is the idea that we know and we can agree about what injustice is, but justice is much harder to pin down, much harder to understand. I think what we're talking about, in a way, there's a lot of stuff about what works and what doesn't work. I think we should focus, in a sense, on what's much easier to agree about, which is what doesn't work, I mean, that's the starting point. We can focus and we can agree. And then I think we start the philosophy. And this is where we start talking about what really education is for, what kind of lives we want children to have, and how difficult it is, actually, to discuss these issues together. That's philosophy.
Don't try and answer everything. Just you give us 1 minute of whatever your final thought is, and that'll be it.
Why do I champion sort of being an evidence-informed practitioner? Why am I interested in research? Because I think teachers should ask impertinent questions to those in authority, whether it's your deputy head or assistant head giving you some strategy they expect to observe in your lesson next time, or whether it's a government that decides to hand down on tablets of stone systems for your classroom. I'm not content being part of a profession that will not ask questions, and that's what research is, asking questions. I'm not happy to be part of a profession that's dominated by arguments by authority, received wisdom, pseudoscience and nonsense.
Thanks, Nick.
Teachers can teach or they can't. Again, we've all been to school. Everybody in the room's been to school. We all know that. We've spent time with some teachers who've worked for us and some teachers who haven't. Certainly, when I look back at my education, I spent a huge amount of time working really hard, particularly when I was in high school. And again, I think that students clearly teach themselves. The best teachers will really work with the students to help that happen. But when it comes down to it, the students have to want to learn and have to be able to learn, have to be structured, and you've got to support them to learn. So I think the point that teachers can or can't teach, again, it may or may not work for you, and those teachers who don't work, we shouldn't have them about. I think when it comes down to it, when we look at can research tell us things? Yes, it can. There's lots of information we know about learning. So we know and we understand a lot about how people learn. Nick talked about working memory and other ideas which come through from psychology. And those things, again, teachers should be taught those rather than a lot of the things which certainly I was trained in with Vygotsky and Piaget, which have a place. But again, the understanding psychology makes a big difference. If teachers understand how learning works, then beyond that, to be a good teacher, you need to make sure that you're consistent, both in yourself and with the children that you teach. It's very difficult to teach children who are not there regularly, and those are big issues that we have to face in school. And then finally, again, we know from psychology, you need to be focused on what you're doing, so you need time on task. Again, research tells us all those things about how to help people to learn, but how you actually teach people, the actual job of teaching, which is such an all-encompassing word, is very difficult.
I mean, I kind of wish that all the research energy would go into more subject-based areas, so that historians would learn how to teach history a little bit better than they're doing at the moment. English teachers, physics, all the rest of that would devote a little bit more energy to that, because I think in those areas there's a lot of interesting sort of insights that could be gained, rather than sort of final words in relation to that. Somebody made a point very eloquently about, we use research in all domains of life. Why not in education? I do think that there are areas that are inappropriate for science, where the wisdom of science has got nothing to say. I mean, I've written books about parenting, where I argue that the science of parenting is not worth the paper that it's written on. I think that what happens in the classroom experience can be informed by science, but the actual relationships and the practices cannot be reduced to their kind of evidential kind of base. And I do think that what's exciting that's happening to teachers when teachers talk to themselves. So I'm all for all the initiatives that are going on. I actually think that people learn far more from that than they do when they go to teachers training schools. And somebody asked the question, well, a PhD in English, give me a guy with a PhD in English, and I'll turn that person into a wonderful teacher. I'm fairly convinced of that, because knowing so much stuff, even if that person's got a stiff personality and is very insensitive, gives you the basis to kind of work on in a way that you often underestimate. And I think that on balance, we don't take those. I would like to see much more teachers with PhDs in their subjects, and I think you'll see the results would be much better than they are at the moment.
Yeah.
I think actually the debate that we're having this morning is really a very old debate about the difference between pedagogy and the subject knowledge dimensions of a teacher. And despite the last hour and a half and what I've been saying, I actually agree that pedagogy has been overstated as an influencing factor in the education of children. Because actually pedagogy is how you teach, the method of teaching, how people learn. But what you teach, the subject, the depth of your understanding, all those are incredibly important dimensions in teaching. But I don't think you can dismiss pedagogy and say it's irrelevant, and that's why I don't think, and there has been an attack on university education departments for understandable reasons, because frankly some of them are just not good enough. But the idea of understanding of theories of knowledge, research in education, those are valuable, but they are not a substitute, or they cannot make up for an inadequacy in subject knowledge, which is why the fund we set up was actually to support subject knowledge in teachers. It wasn't to enhance their understanding of educational research or the science of teaching. It was actually to enable them to improve their subject knowledge, because we felt that was one of the things which could make a huge difference. So yes, let's understand and put pedagogy in its place. It's not the silver bullet in itself, but it has value, and I think teachers look to it as a way of understanding what their profession does and how it does it differently. But that has to be alongside subject knowledge. And there is an opportunity cost always. When you spend time on one thing, does that mean you're spending time away from something else? And that's something that, teachers, I think, will find in their own time.
Chris, can I say thanks very much to yourself and the school for sponsoring the session, and Jack and Frank and Nick and Manir, can I thank you very much for coming along on a Sunday and being on the panel. Give them a big final round of applause.